Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We have a very exciting evening for all of you and a sold-out audience, which is really exciting. So, yeah. So welcome to our first Wednesday lecture series. I am Jonathan Casey. I'm the curator of our fish and invertebrate team here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. But thank you all for joining us in the theater, and to all those who are watching online as well. We have a really exciting evening. We'd like to first thank our sponsors, so Stephen and Brenda Olson, the Osborne and Rourke Charitable Trust, and the Courtyard by Marriott Long Beach Hotel. So I'd like to start things off with introducing two of my friends and close colleagues. We get to collaborate with them, and our invited guest speakers. So Dr. Ryan Freedman is joining us today, and Andrew Pettit, who will be co-presenting on the recovery of the giant sea bass. So very exciting presentation. After their talk, there will be a brief Q&A with our audience, so we'll go over that a little bit more as we get closer. But a little bit about our speakers first and foremost. So Dr. Ryan Freedman is a research ecologist at NOAA Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuaries, one of our partners. His work focuses on marine protected area effectiveness, connectivity of marine species, and the impacts of climate change on marine resources. He has a bachelor's degree in biology in marine science from University of Miami. He also has a master's in biology from California State University in Long Beach, and he has a PhD in ecology and marine biology from UC Santa Barbara. Our second speaker, who will be co-presenting with Ryan this evening, is Andrew Pettit. He served as the project scientist and lead researcher for the Spotting Giant Sea Bass project, which we're going to talk a little bit about tonight, with the UCSB Marine Science Institute. His work answers essential questions regarding the population, spatial patterns, and ecology of giant sea bass. He has a bachelor's in ecology and evolutionary biology, and a master's in ecology and marine biology from UCSB. He currently resides in Hawaii, where he just moved recently, and he's pursuing his PhD at University of Hawaii at Manoa. So, without further ado, if you guys could all please silence your cell phones, we'll go ahead and bring up our speakers.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's really exciting to talk to a full house, and it's really exciting to be here with Andrew, who's one of my students. And what Jonathan failed to mention is that tomorrow Andrew gets the pleasure of defending his master's, so he actually gets to do this twice. Yeah, that's a big round of applause, right? It's a big accomplishment. Everyone should feel proud. But we're both here talking about a fish that we both love very much, which is the giant sea bass. And if you are fortunate to be able to come back to the aquarium, there's a couple on display. You should definitely check them out. They're really neat. And it's a really cool fish that's off of our local waters that I've had the pleasure of working on now for over 6 years. And you can see here is a really cool picture of one. But the best way to kind of see a giant sea bass is just let them kind of speak for themselves. So I'm going to show you a short little video of some brub footage where there's some bait on the end of this camera arm, and you're going to see one kind of come in. So these fish are big. You can see they're much bigger than anything else in the frame. I stand at about 6 feet. These fish can get to about 7 feet long. So this is a big animal we're talking about. I think when most people think of the ocean, they think sharks are the only big predators out there, or dolphins are one of the only big predators out there. Fish can get really big. And so this is kind of the king of the kelp forest, right? So this is the top ecosystem predator in these systems, and they've only recently come back. And we're going to tell you a really neat story about how these fish have come back from a lot of pressures that we see in Southern California. So again, here's a picture of one next to a diver, just so you can get a sense of how big they are. This is actually a wreck fish. Even though we call it a sea bass, it's not technically a sea bass. That's just the name that a lot of people originally gave it because they look much like some of the other sea bass or Goliath grouper that are out there. This is what they look like as babies, and they're much, much smaller, right? So this is what a little guy looks like. And you can see they change quite a bit, but those spots Andrew's going to talk about a lot are really important, and he'll have the pleasure of talking about it. But they look really different. They change their life cycle. Their life cycle changes. So you can see here, they start as this planktonic animal. Here, I actually should do that, right? They start this planktonic animal and kind of shift through this life cycle until eventually they become these big big monsters you see here. They reach maturity at about 11 to 13 years. They could take 6 years to reach about 30 pounds, 10 years to reach about 100 pounds, and 15 years to reach about 150 pounds. So we're talking about a big animal, as I've said, and they can live up to 76 years of age. And the way we know that is by counting the vertebrae rings. So when we catch one, we can actually count them like tree trunks. So the same way you would count a tree trunk, we can count them in the actual ring of the vertebrae, and that's our best guesstimate of the oldest one we've ever seen. So you can see here's one feeding. Again, so you see they kind of, anything that fits, they'll eat. This is the diet study they have. You can see that just anything they can get their mouth around, they're happy to swallow. So this diet, the diet is very, this is primarily from San Diego, right? So there's a little bit of a bias, even though they can go more north where they're encountering different things. But basically what it means is the same. If it fits, it's going inside. They're going to eat it, they're going to try, and this generalist diet means that they're happy living in a bunch of different places. As long as there's kelp forest and there's safety and there's rocky reef, they're happy to be there. And they can be found as shallow as a couple feet to all the way as deep. We've recorded them to, I think, over 100 to 200 feet down on ROV. So big range for this animal, and they're eating everything within that range, which is sort of an interesting thing. This habitat range, so they're coming all the way from the southern tip of Baja all the way up to Humboldt Bay. After about point conception, it's a little bit rarer to see them. Usually they're carried there on El Niños and then over winter, so their population's not as large as south of point conception. So we have a couple of key hotspots for these species: Catalina Island, Anacapa Island, Santa Barbara Island. So as Jonathan mentioned, I work for the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, which of these two are in. They're also a national park. We also have known hotspots in Redondo Beach, Hermosa Artificial Reef, which basically is an area that we built out to be a reef. It's not a natural spot. And then also in La Jolla down by San Diego. So the courtship and reproduction for these species are sort of unique. They have a courtship behavior that's kind of illustrated here, where you see the male kind of chases around the female, and they kind of nudge and bump them, as typical of males. They're very annoying. And you can see here is kind of what that behavior looks like in the wild. You can see here this would be the male kind of circling around and chasing it. And then once there's kind of the female relents, they'll rush up and do a spawning rush. And that's how they breed. There's also some thoughts that sound is really important for them, so they do a croaking or a booming, and it's thought that that's done by basically beating their ribs on their swim bladder, basically like tapping a drum, and that's also key in courtship, which is why we think that there might be issues from sound damage to them as it'll interrupt that courtship behavior. So what happened to giant sea bass? As I said, that we kind of have thought about this as a recovering species, and well, what happened is we happened. So these are some old photos of fishing derbies. You can see they get really big. Actually, a really neat story is Larry Allen did a lot of this work. And so in trying to understand or reconstruct the stock from back in the day, the weird routes that science takes people, is he actually had to study how tall the average man was in California to then go back and try and get a guesstimate of how big these fish here are. And so these are all kind of from this local Southern California area. They were taken as big sport fish back in the day and just hammered. You can see here, this is the commercial landings for them from 1916 to 1919. You can see they were taken all the way in the 30s and 40s, all the way out into the 70s, so this population crashed. This is when they became banned in fishing from 1980. So there's now a current ban that still stands with the state where you can't take this fish anymore. And then you can see we have a 95% decline in the population that's standing of the current stock. So kind of it was a scary situation and happened relatively fast in the way that we think about fishery declines. And then back here in 1994, there was a nearshore gillnet ban, which is one of the other primary ways that they were taken and captured. So here you can see in recent memory, we've seen a lot of divers actually come back to the scientific community and be like, hey, we're seeing this big fish in this water, and what is it? And it's coming back, and we're seeing more and more people report it. And then when we started to look at kind of these CPUE and these landings, which is basically catch per unit effort. What basically that means is like for how many hours I spent fishing, this is how many sea bass I caught, and you're basically standardizing that. So when you look at this graph right here, basically for every hour or so I spend fishing, we're catching more and more of these sea bass. And you can see in 2002 and 2004, we're seeing a number of more from these surveys too. So in the recent memory, we're getting these increases of these fishes coming back to this ecosystem, which raises a whole number of questions, as they've been pretty much locally at really reduced numbers for so long. So what do we need to know? We have a big fish that's coming back. We have a top predator back in its ecosystem after 20 years of being missing. That brings a lot of questions as we care about the ecosystems that we are in charge of protecting off our own coastline. The population trend is first and foremost, and that is basically the scientific way of saying how many of these things are out in the water, right? How many of these fish are coming back? Is it growing? Is it changing? What's the population? Then we have habitat use and site fidelity, which is basically where do they like to go? How long do they like to stay there? Are they moving big distances? Are they trying to stay towards one or two kinds of habitats? And as these top predators return that habitat, they have downward stream effects on the ecosystem. So even if you don't really care about this fish in general, having a large predator in that ecosystem changes the way that ecosystem functions, right? So then, and the last one is like, what are the current threats to recovery? So if we're seeing changes to this ecosystem, how do we actually work through all these different ways to make sure that we're protecting and continuing any trajectory of recovery that we're seeing? And so I'm going to bring up my student, and I want a warm welcome because he's going to be presenting all this again tomorrow. So he's doing it twice and nicely for you to talk about one of the first ways that we're going to try and get to that first question of how many of these fish are there?
All right. Well, thank you, Ryan, for that intro. And yes, I'm giving this talk tomorrow. But yeah, so there has never been a direct assessment of the giant sea bass population within its entire range, and specifically within Southern California. So if we are really trying to understand, we see this increase, but this potential evidence of an increase in population, but we need to understand if it's actually, in fact, an actual increase of population. So how on earth do we study and do we understand the population of this elusive, critically endangered giant fish, right? There's something quite interesting with this fish. They have these beautiful little spots here. And so thanks to researchers actually with the Aquarium of the Pacific, we determined back in 2018 that they have unique spot patterns. So back in 2014, 3 researchers, or 4, went out to the Blue Cavern site right here, and they actually took photos of every single giant sea bass every single hour for 4 days, and then over a 24-hour period for 2 days. And they randomly sorted all the images and ran it through a machine learning algorithm called I3S. And they determined that almost with exact 100% accuracy, that they were able to identify every single fish to a T. And so that's where we're able to learn that they have unique spot patterns. And so how this machine learning algorithm works is we actually orient the image, orient the image based on the eye, the dorsal fin, and the caudal fin. And because of this amazing new technology, a team of researchers, that team, which is the Milton Love Lab, and then the Benioff Ocean Science Lab, and also partnership with the Aquarium of the Pacific, created a website called Spotting Giant Sea Bass. And so I have sort of a QR code on the bottom right corner where you can actually, it directs you to our website. And so basically, what the Spotting Giant Sea Bass website is we ask the community to submit photos of giant sea bass. So they're large, they're very charismatic, they're a very lovable creature, and so they're actually worth, a research study came out saying that they're worth $2.3 million to the ecotourism industry for recreational diving. And so let's say, right, you're going out to Casino Point, you see this incredible giant, you have a GoPro, you took a photo. What do I do now? So you go on the website, and you click Submit. You can just drag and drop an image, so JPEG, MPG, or MP4, even a video. If you only have a video, that's totally fine too. And then report the encounter and the time if you have the time. And then where exactly you saw the fish. The incredible thing about the recreational diving industry is that, recreational divers, that they are very good with their data, and so a lot of times we actually have exact GPS coordinates of where this fish was seen, which is incredible. And then you can also provide depth, the name, and then any other, this is just a random example, but any other information you might have about the individual giants or the multiple giants that you saw. You can even give information about the courting behavior that Ryan mentioned before, any spawning behavior, which if you see that, you're going to be one of the first who've ever seen that, because they're believed that they spawn at night. Aggregation, eating, and also the life stage and the estimated length as well. All right, so we have that data. Thank you to the person who submitted the image. Now what happens? So the team at Spotting Giant Sea Bass, they actually identify these spots. And again, like I mentioned, they orient it based on the eye, the second dorsal fin, and the pectoral fin base. We now have 2 machine learning algorithms. We have the I3S and what's called the modified Groth algorithm. The interesting thing about the Groth algorithm is that that's actually the the machine learning algorithm that's derived from NASA that they actually use for the Spatial Hubble telescope. So how the Hubble telescope actually orients itself is based on identifying star constellations, and we realize that those star constellations, how it orients its image, you can do the same thing for giant sea bass. And they actually do the same thing for whale sharks as well, I believe. All right, so once you've identified that individual, we then spit it out into the algorithm, and it gives us potential matches. The higher the match score, the better. So this is a phenomenal match here. So you can see that the colors of each spot correlate with the correct position, right? And so I've spent a lot of time with these images, and I've seen a lot of these giant sea bass. So I already know that this is giant sea bass 179. This one was seen at Casino Point, and we have a pretty good match score of 28 here. So with this incredible data that we've had, right? So this project was created in 2016, but because of the beautiful thing of photography nowadays, right? It's digital. Is that we actually have data that dates back all the way to 1997, and to be fair, that photo was actually on film. But so, for example, this is giant sea bass 179, and this fish has been seen 21 times. All on Casino Point throughout multiple years. So this gives us a really interesting long-term assessment and understanding of where this fish is, how they're behaving, and if there's any potential temporal variations with their movements. But also, it gives us really critical information on their population. So a very key methodology for assessing fish populations, because you're not going to be able to sample out the entire population, obviously, is a modeling technique called mark recapture, where you basically mark a certain fish. So sometimes it's through tagging, where you just have a mark, or in this case, actually knowing the individual through its spots. And over multiple sampling periods, you're able to actually assess how many that you're resighting, and that actually, with various population models, gives you an actual number of how many fish are within a given area. So, to give us an understanding of how much we have here, so we've got data from 1997 to the present. We now have over 1,600 reported encounters within Southern California. And out of that over 1,600, we have about 1,100 which are verified. When I mean verified, it means that they have a clear image of their spots, and they're oriented in a way where I'm actually able to identify all their spots on their flank. And so through this, we have 603 unique left-sided individuals and 589 right-side individuals. And why I separate out the right and the left side is because the spot patterns on each side are unique, and so I want to not double count, so I actually model each side independently. And so we have data all the way from La Jolla to Northern California. Above Point Conception, we actually only have about 7, which I'll go into in a bit. But for this study, for basically my master's project, I assessed the entire Southern California bight. And so we see here that we have some hotspots. So what Ryan has mentioned before, right? So that's Redondo Beach and Hermosa Artificial Reef. That's Casino Point, Little Farmsworth. That's La Jolla area. That's actually Wheeler North Artificial Reef, which is in front of the San Onofre nuclear power plant area. That's Santa Barbara Island. They just love that entire area. And then Anacapa. And you can see, too, as well, that there is a surveying effort component into this as well. All right, so how does marker capture work? So how I did it is I have enough data, so even though the project was created in 2016, I actually have plenty of data dating before that, so I actually was able to incorporate 2015 into the study. So every single year is defined as a sampling period, and if the fish was seen in that year, it's given a 1. If it was not seen, it's given a 0. And so in doing so, I create a data matrix, right? So every single row is one ID, and every single column is a year. So even if that fish was seen 20 times in that 1 year, right, it still gives a 1. And so you spit that out into various algorithms. I won't bore you too much. And what that outputs us is various things. So one model gave me what's called the superpopulation, or the total number of individuals that have been within the study area, so Southern California, from 2015 to 2022. Since they live up to 76 years old, right, it's very easy to assume that every single fish within that given area is most likely still alive, because I only modeled the adults. And also another model is what I call a Pareto model. It actually gives us lambda, or the rate of change. So how much that population is actually increasing, or what we call the replacement rate. So this is my first model. This is giving me an assessment of their sampling instantaneous values per year. This model is not the most robust for that, but it gives me the superpopulation. And so for 2015 to 2022, my best fit model shows us that we have an estimated 1,221 adult individuals. Okay. So it's really important to understand that we have a good baseline there. My other model shows me that lambda is 1.08. So a lambda that's less than 1 means that decreasing population. A lambda of exactly 1 means a stagnant population. A value above 1 means that the population is increasing. So that's a very good sign. So this is validating previous research that has shown that we have an increasing population from this study period. Oh, yes. We'll talk like this now. Oh, is that better? Okay, perfect. I will speak louder. I'll just lean like this. Hold that. All right. So to validate this, right, so we have a lot of, that's actually a lot better. Thank you for that. So we have a lot of community science data, right? So there's definitely some sampling bias there, some survey effort issues, So I wanted to validate this with another source of data. And so I obtained the California Department of Fish and Wildlife landings receipt data. So back in 1994, which is what Ryan mentioned, there was a nearshore gillnet ban. That ban gave it, so you're not allowed to, commercial gillnetters, they sometimes incidentally catch giant sea bass. And this clause allows them to still catch and land, so sell, 1 giant sea bass per trip. So this gives us really interesting information to see, well, okay, so that's a fisheries-dependent data source. And so are they seeing the same trend? Are they also seeing an increase in the population? And so I calculated the catch per unit effort, so the number of giant sea bass caught per trip per year. And we're also seeing an increase. And this time, this data is even longer. So I've got it from 1994, so when the ban started, all the way up to 2022. So that also helps validate that we're also seeing an increase from this data source as well. To even furthermore validate this is a bit more anecdotal, but within the Spotting Giant Sea Bass website, we're also seeing an increase in juvenile sightings. So our first juvenile that was reported onto the website was back in 2017. We didn't get, I don't think, any in 2018, and then progressively from then on out, we're seeing more and more, which is phenomenal. And we're also seeing them in areas that I honestly did not think we would see them. So for example, Long Beach Harbor. I did not think we were going to see any baby giant sea bass there. Also within the San Diego Bay, there's actually been 3 or 4 reported encounters from people fishing within the bay as well. And so I also want to highlight too that this one and this one were caught from recreational fishermen. So yes, the majority of our data comes from recreational scuba divers, but also a good amount of our data comes from recreational fishermen, which gives us really interesting information because where they fish is not usually where people also dive. So it's a good variation of sampling effort. And so also the HCMS Yukon, which is a sunken ship off of Point Loma, the spot. Redondo Beach, that's actually a pretty well-known one. And then Corona Del Mar is one that I've actually seen within the past 2 years. All right, so let's sum this up, okay? So giant sea bass population from both the fisheries data and my data shows that the population is increasing. That's phenomenal. Population is approximately 1,200 within Southern California. That's adults. But we need to understand that we need to put that into context. So 1,200 individuals for a giant top predator within this entire area is really not that much. And it is we're still very far from a full population recovery, but this is phenomenal news. But as they're increasing, we now have an increased opportunity to understand more about their life history and their behavior. So once they come back to certain areas, we need to understand why, where they're utilizing these areas, their spatial patterns, their potential seasonalities, any potential harm that they have within these areas. And we need to understand how, when you bring back this top predator, how that might actually change the food web dynamics of these given areas. So I'm going to bring Ryan back on the stage to talk more about this.
So movements is sort of a specialty of mine. I've studied movements now for over 20 years. I've always been interested in why the fish goes where it goes, and which is where I cue in. And so when we see this big predator come back to an ecosystem that NOAA and the sanctuary cares very deeply about, where these things are pretty critical to protection, right? So as we're thinking as a management agency, how do we make sure that these fish continue to recover in this way? A lot of the ways that we manage our water is spatial, which basically means we're carving out areas and saying we're protecting this spot, we're protecting this sanctuary, we're putting this MPA in place. And so understanding where these animals go become a critical function of how we actually protect the species and ensure that population recovery that Andrew was seeing continues into the future. So we do this in kind of two types. I'm going to talk, the first is acoustic telemetry, which is a tag that you can actually either put inside of the animal through surgery or put on the outside. I'll show you how that happens in a little bit. And that tag basically has a crystal that makes a sound. And that sound is spaced out over a couple milliseconds, so very quick. And the spaces in between those sounds lead to an ID number. And then we put out these stations that kind of listen for these, the tags that they go by, we call them receivers. As the receiver goes by, the tag makes as the fish swims through the receiver, the tag will make a sound. That sound clicks at an ultrasonic frequency of 69 kilohertz. That tag is then picked up. The receiver records the time, date, location, and ID of where that fish swam through. And so that takes a lot of work, right? You're maintaining receivers all around the water. You have to actually catch these fish and tag them. And then there's another methodology called satellite tags, where you actually just pop the tag into the fish. The tag itself records the temperature, depth, and light, basically like how dark the water is, and then uses a model to guess where the fish is. And that's great because the tag pops off, it comes up to the surface, the satellite collects that data for you, but the problem is it's not very exact. So you want to use a mix of both of these technologies to make sure that you're getting the best kind of change of that spatial position of where the animal's moving. Unfortunately, the satellite telemetry is in progress, so I don't have a whole ton of data for you. But I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the telemetry work that we've been doing, the acoustics work. So again, here you can see this is what a receiver would look like. This tag kind of comes through, that ID comes through the sounds, and you can see as the fish swim through, you would get it, but then any untagged fish are pretty much ghosts to the system. So the more tags you're able to put out, the better your tagging study will be. So I'm going to show you how kind of it works. We give the fish a really expensive earring. You're going to see kind of underwater. Here's the fish coming through, and I'll just let it happen. The fish is not too happy about his earring, but you can see our diver is very happy. So this is what an array looked like. Santa Barbara Island is a really neat island. It's probably one of the hardest channel islands to get to. It's about 22 miles west of Catalina. So it's a little rock. It's about a mile by a mile wide. And to kind of orientate you to what this looks like, each of these little spots is a receiver. So it's where we've placed a listening station. And then basically the more red you are, the more detection. So the more that animal has passed by that little sound gate. And you can see they really like this like little mound area. And what that is it's this promontory right? So it's a big rocky outcrop that kind of pops up in the middle of nowhere. And we're finding from places like Catalina, places like La Jolla, places like Anacapa, they like and cue in onto these rocky outcrops. And we think that's really important for breeding, right? They're coming to this one discrete small area. But they're not there all the time. So, right, so we know they're there in space, but we also know that they're coming in more at night. So you can see here's a 24-hour clock. You see a lot of the detection time picks up kind of afternoon. They like to sleep in. They're pretty lazy. It's a big animal. They got to grow and get big. And then we see a lot of this activity kind of happen in the nighttime and kind of trail off around 2 in the morning. They're also heavy partiers. And then here I'm going to show you again that same slide we saw before with the island, but you're going to kind of cue into the time clock up here. It'll show the month, and you're going to see how those detections change through time. So again, here's the time clock. There's a lot of activity in kind of September and October, and then it gets cold, and everyone leaves for the winter because the water's really cold here. I don't know if anyone's tried to go swimming in December. It's not great. They agree with you, and then sometime when it starts to warm back up, we'll see June kind of comes around right now, and the party picks back up, right? So we see that there's this great seasonality to the detections. Again, the more activity, the higher the color, and you can see they're really queuing into that top corner of the island and not really using a whole ton of other habitat space. And this is just, again, showing that kind of data cleaner in a non-video format. But you can see, again, August, September, October, it's that hotspot time. Does anyone have a guess of what they might be doing? Oh, I heard babies. That's right. Yeah. They're coming around to make babies, right? That courtship behavior. They're all coming down. It makes sense to all come together when you want to make babies, right? Because it takes 2 to tango. And all that aggregation activity that we see, we think is primarily around courtship and breeding. And so the sightings data, I'm going to let kind of Andrew talk about how his data fits into the telemetry data we have.
It takes 2 to tango. I like that. Okay. All right, so we have this idea, right? So we've got all of this acoustic telemetry where we've got this finer scale movement. We understand what's going on by day, right? But we still don't fully understand what they're doing over multiple years. And so that's where the incredible spotting giant sea bass, the community science side of things really helps out here. So from what spotting giant sea bass has seen so far, the furthest distance seen between resightings is actually with Hermosa Artificial Reef number 4, also termed Mr. Scratch. So you realize, first off, that this fish is named after a site. That was back when we first started, where we actually thought that these fish have really high site fidelity where they don't even move to a given area at all. They only stay on this one site. This fish right here proved that wrong, so now we call them GSBs. But this fish went from La Jolla Shores to Hermosa Artificial Reef, and actually recently went back from Hermosa Artificial Reef back to La Jolla. So not only went 96 miles north, but went 96 miles back south, which is pretty incredible too. And so we also have GSB 191 here, who Randy Harwood, I remember he sent me an email a few years ago saying, hey, I've got this giant sea bass off of Italian Gardens back in 01. You guys don't want that, right? Because project wasn't around then. It was like, no, please. And we actually matched it to GSB 191 that was seen in 2005 and 2021. So we now have this one fish that has been seen at the same site 3 times over a 20-year period. So I also want to show here, this is a GIF I made, but this is also GSB 136, also nicknamed Tri-tail, which I'll get into real soon. But this is actually our second most seen fish off of Catalina Island, so seen 19 times from 2017 to 2023. And basically, we first see him in Big Fisherman's Cove, then he goes to Eco Reef and just keeps moving constantly around Catalina Island. Never leaves Catalina Island, but moves around quite consistently. And this fish is only seen within months from March to November, so never seen in the actual cold winter months. So that also gives us an interesting understanding as well. So this is GSB 191. This is actually a photo off of Lion's Head. And it's nicknamed tri-tail because it has this really interesting caudal fin here where it's got a little split fin and a little bit of white here. I want you guys to pay attention to this fin right here for the next slide. Okay, so this is also GSP 178, also nicknamed Fat Albert. This one, if you've dove Casino Point, you've probably seen this fish. It's been seen 21 times in Casino Point from 2018 to 2023. When I talk to the dive masters at Casino Point, they're like, "Oh yeah, that's Fat Albert. He's there. He's out there today. Like he's just around." But also, why I mentioned the caudal fin with GSP 136. What's the fish behind this one? Oh, that's right. Yeah, same day, same encounter from actually the same individual. But it turns out that those two were hanging out and were friends that day. It's quite interesting. But also, again, because I've spent so much time, and maybe you don't care, but I really do, they have very interesting spot patterns. And so I love GSP 178 because it has this really unique circular pattern that you can actually see on its right side as well. And GSP 136 has a nice, cool parallel line. Once you look through all the data, you'll be like, oh yeah, that's really cool. It's not just me, I promise. All right, so to summarize these long distance movements, right? So we've got Hermosa Artificial Reef 4 here. It's the longest one. We've also got 6 other giant sea bass that have been recorded giving either a long distance movement or an inter-island movement. So this gives us really interesting information on their potential population connectivity, right? So we know that they're aggregative species. They like to broadcast spawn in the summer within given areas. We want to see if there's any potential for genetic exchange, or is it basically one giant population with a bunch of micro populations where they're essentially mating with each other every year. It's pretty important for us to understand this. And so we've got a few going from Catalina to Anacapa to Santa Cruz, Hermosa Artificial Reef to Catalina and elsewhere. This also really gives us some information on any potential stopover hubs, basically really important areas for maybe further protections. And so one that I want to highlight here is Hermosa Artificial Reef 4 right here. So we've got 3 instances of a fish moving in or out within that area going to a long distance, which is quite important for us to understand, and is an unprotected reef right now because it is an artificial reef. And I also want to say that within our data set currently, only 4.7% of resighted giant sea bass have actually been with a documented long distance or inter-island movement. So that also shows that they really do like their given areas and they don't venture off too much within our data and what we know currently. So I'm going to bring Ryan back onto the stage to help summarize both of these long-term and short-term movements.
Yeah, we appreciate you putting up with all the switching. So these fish are moving in these tight aggregations, right? We know that they're breeding. We don't know much about their winter movements. We're trying to figure that out now with some of the satellite tags. But these tight aggregations leave these animals at risk. And as Andrew pointed out, he's only had 7 individuals kind of make those movements out of the potential 100 or 1,000 so individuals that are in the population, right? So only small amounts of these individuals will move to these different breeding sites, which means each of these locations are really critical for protection as we think about the communities and the ecologies of these fish moving forward. And that low connectivity means that we have, in my data and in Andrew's data, we have high interannual returns. They're coming back to the same spot after disappearing in the winter. And we think that these aggregations are somewhat stable, which means that when people were fishing for them back in the 30s and 40s and hammering them, you could take out a massive swath of the population by just hitting one little reef or one little rock because they were coming back to these really tight areas for these big fish, right? So that is how they effectively remove the population so quickly. And that still stands for a lot of threats that these animals face, right? If you're able to impact a small little area and take out 1/5 of the population, that's a pretty scary reality for the fish thinking about it moving forward, right? And this low connectivity means these aggregations may be really distinct. And that means that genetically, that diversity, especially as they're coming back from a genetic bottleneck, we need to make sure that we're maintaining as many areas of diversity as possible as we bring these fish back. So we talked about kind of these 2 steps. What are the threats that these fish face into the future, right? So how are we going to think about protecting this animal going forward? This connectivity, as I said, brings risk. We know that the chance of new adult individuals moving to populations, so if we locally extirpate one or something happens to the population at Casino Point, other individuals, adults coming back to replenish that is probably pretty low, right? These fish are moving in between these populations, but as we said, the aggregations, they're looking to breed. So again, if you're a fish kind of like looking to continue your genetic line and you're showing up and you're the only player in town, you're gonna go find somewhere else to go. And then again, these aggregations are acting independently. There's some thought from the timing that they're somewhat temperature triggered. So those that are in warmer waters kind of start earlier, and then up by us in the islands where it's colder, they start later, and then when it gets really cold and the fish leave, they end potentially earlier too. So we know that fishing is a big threat for them, and pollution. So this pollution, you can see this fish got like carved up by, it grew into some netting or some other kind of piece of wire that was left in the water. We know that pollution could affect them. They're also top predators. California has a really cool long history of environmental protection, but we also have a really nasty history of dumping a lot of crud into the water. So we have a lot of legacy pollutants. These things are at the top of the food chain that could potentially affect these things as they're eating more and more of the fish below them. They basically can accumulate these materials, and we're still trying to understand how those impacts could work. We also know that fishing, they are closed. There's a ban, but there is a loophole that allows the continued take of them. Understanding how many are caught, how they survive post-release. So even if a fisherman releases them, how is that fish going to continue is a big question we have. And then how much the fish are actually being taken, and to what level does that impact the population recovery are still open questions that we're trying to work with the state and with NOAA, other parts, to understand that risk and impact. And then also there's climate, right? So climate change is something that affects us all. I think we're all feeling the 100-degree heat that we're all bracing impact for later. And it's no different for these fish. So back in 2014, we actually had a marine heat wave, which most people don't realize that happened. Maybe some people got in the water and felt like it was really nice. I think it got up to like 80 or 90 degrees in La Jolla that year, which is wild for our coastline. And that led to these other issues. This is a study or a work from up in northern Mendocino County. You can see here's 2008, all the kelp forest that was up there, and then 2014, which is the onset of that heat wave. You can see huge reduction in kelp habitat. And this is what is critical for this fish to survive. So if we're losing all this important habitat to climate, we're gonna see a lot of habitat reduction for this fish. But there also might be a benefit where because this fish likes warmer water than up north, it might also expand its range up there, but then it's feeding on things and interacting in an ecosystem that has never seen this fish before. So there's potential pluses and minuses that this fish will see as the waters are likely to warm off California, but understanding that and predicting that in the future is something that we're trying to disentangle with a number of both the movement studies and the habitat preferences we see for this animal. And then I'll let Andrew take it home.
All right, and I think Ryan had a good point there about climate change and with the increase of ocean temperatures, right? So that with climate change also, we have a change in oceanographic currents. And so what Ryan mentioned previously, a few slides before, is there's times where we do see giants north of Point Conception. Normally we think it's because of changes in El Nino. So El Nino is where the water temperatures in the area generally is pretty warm. That also changes the current. So the Alaskan current, so the current going south down into the Santa Barbara Channel weakens during this time. And so when these giant sea bass spawn, it's believed that their eggs might actually reach north of Point Conception where they settle and potentially can help increase the population there. With an increase in marine heat waves, we might see an increase in this as well. And so currently, this is preliminary findings, we actually are seeing an increase in giant sea bass north of Point Conception in Northern California. And it's really funny because when I tell this to a lot of Northern California dive shops and divers are like, what are you talking about? There's no giant sea bass in Monterey Bay. They just don't exist. And I'm like, well, I'm seeing them. They're coming around. So we only right now only have 7 verified encounters north of Point Conception, but they are in Monterey Bay, Santa Cruz, and all the way north, all the way up to Half Moon Bay, which is pretty interesting. A lot of them are actually from halibut fishers, which is also pretty interesting as well. And I do want to add too that mostly because, especially with New Brighton Beach, all those encounters, from what I've heard, I have never been there myself, but I've heard that it's a pretty murky and really, frankly, undivable area, but it's also a really good place to catch halibut. So that's also, again, another great benefit of having community science is, these are fishermen, not recreational divers, but we're able to ID them and obtain this data. So this is really interesting, and I've showcased this to a few giant sea bass experts. There's only like 6 of us maybe, and it's incredible. It's incredible. So this actually at first was seen on iNaturalist, which is another incredible community science database. And James Mon here, he's a drone photographer out in Santa Cruz Bay. He's got like 23,000 reported encounters on iNaturalist. He's incredible. And he documented these photos of what online it said giant sea bass in aggregation, and I was so skeptical. I was like, there's no way you saw an aggregation, and truth be told, that's a giant sea bass. And that's off within Santa Cruz and the Pajaro Dunes in the Monterey Bay. So we're seeing this, this was last year, and it's something that we've, at least to science, we have not seen before, or at least recorded, and it's quite fascinating. So this gives us some potential information and some understandings of this. Maybe, we're gonna start seeing more giant sea bass north of Point Conception, that maybe this is due with climate change, or also, the factor of them recovering as well. But the big elephant in the room, right, is we've talked a lot about California. So we do know that the range is from Northern California to here, but 73% of its entire range is actually in Mexico. There's reports that actually have them dating all the way back, or down to Oaxaca. So that's a pretty, so my thesis, my work, is just here, but we have a whole lot more to understand as well. So one question is, we need to understand how the population is doing within its entire range, especially since in Mexico, there is still a commercial and recreational fishery happening, where they're actually catching 4,200 individuals per year. So it's believed that the populations in Mexico are a lot healthier, but just because we're catching a ton of individuals does not necessarily mean that the population is healthy. We've seen that back in 1930s, where in 1932, when we caught 600,000 pounds of giant sea bass, we probably thought that the population was doing just fine, and that was not the case. So for future research, like Ryan mentioned, we're going to be deploying these satellite tags. So this will actually give us really a much better, finer scale understanding of these movements. So we've got acoustic tags, satellite tags, and in combination with spotting giant sea bass, we're going to be able to fill in these cracks. So we've got long-term assessment of their spatial patterns, and then these fine scale movements as well. We're basically putting all the pieces back into the puzzle. We're going to also increase the spotted giant sea bass database, so please keep uploading this data. We wouldn't be able to find anything out about this fish if it weren't for the actual community itself. So thank you all for I know there's a good amount of you who actually submitted to our site, and please keep doing so. And then we're also going to start increasing our outreach and more research into Mexican waters as well. This is just in general within marine science, we really don't understand and don't know how climate change is going to really impact these marine top predators, even though you would think that there is going to be this northward expansion of these top predators. There's also the basal resource, so the kelp forest, is also being hurt as well. So if you don't have the forest, you can't hold as many species as well. All right, so the spotted giant sea bass, we actually have a quarterly newsletter to keep you all updated into our current research, where we will be giving talks. We also give out, sometimes on certain occasions, shirts, hoodies, beanies. We also run photo contests every year, where if you submit a photo, you automatically get entered into a raffle where you can win tickets to the wonderful Aquarium at the Pacific, $100 gift cards to various dive boats and dive shops. So please get involved that way as well. And then we also have an Instagram. We just actually reached 1,000 followers, so yeah, there. But yeah, so that's also where you can see we'll give cute Match Mondays, interesting facts about giant sea bass, and updates there as well. And also, I do want to add, if you do see a giant sea bass and it is brand new to our database, you do have the opportunity to give it a nickname. So that's where Fat Albert came from. We've got Chewbacca, Sebastian. We've got some good ones, so it's free game. And with that, we will take any questions you might have.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Andrew, so much. The moment you've all been waiting for, we're going to go ahead and go into the Q&A session. So both of our speakers are up on stage. They'll have a microphone they can share, and we have two of our staff members in the audience who will be running the microphones to our audience members who have questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, get their attention, and they will bring the mic to you.
Hello, thank you so much. That was really interesting. My question is about how giant sea bass interact with another marine animal that is, we're trying to get to recover, the sea otter. How do those two interact?
I don't think we have a lot of good data because where the sea otters have locally been recovered isn't where the giant sea bass have been recovered, right? So a lot of the recovery for sea otters is north of Point Conception and Monterey. They've had some trouble reestablishing. There's probably some interaction out at San Nick where there's two extant populations, but doing research out there is really hard. It's military controlled. I don't know how much recoveries happen for this fish around there. As you saw in Andrew's research, there's just not many sightings around that area because it's not highly trafficked. So I don't think we have a good answer for that.
Okay, we have one over here. Howdy. So with the spotted patterns on them, are you identifying them from when they're tiny to when they're big? How much do their spots change, or are you not really tracking that just yet?
That's a phenomenal question. Yeah, so we actually have 3 giant sea bass juveniles that were released from Cabrillo, and we took photos of them, and then over various years, and then we released them, saw them again, and so we actually were able to prove that from a baby, so from 5 inches, they had the exact same spot pattern from when they were about 1.5 feet. So that proves it right there. So great question. I forgot to mention that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Besides humans, who are their predators?
There's not a whole bunch known. We assume that probably some of the large sharks could take them out, like white sharks, but they're not heavily included in a lot of the predator diet studies we've seen. There's a couple instances where they've seen smaller ones be in the food diet, but the large ones pretty much not. We do know that like sea lions just like pick on them for fun because they're jerks. And so they'll bite them and chew on them, but it's not mortal. But a lot of the damage you see on them are basically from marine mammals being mean, for lack of a better word.
Okay, we have one over here.
You mentioned that hearing may be important in their courtship behavior and that noise pollution may affect this. Could you expand a little bit on that, and is there any research being done on that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of work being done or to actually isolate the sounds that they make because they're sort of hard to pick out of the soundscape. So we did a study, and then Larry Allen's group has actually also done a study of recording them in the tank to actually like pull the sound wave out because it sounds like a boom, which is really tough to distinguish underwater. And then we've tried to pick that up in the wild, but it's been somewhat difficult. But we do know that in the areas where we have the tagging data that there's loud operations, there's military activities, the boat engines are operating in the same sort of frequency, but the impact, we tried to get there, but we just weren't quite ready yet with actually being able to pull that sound out from the actual study to date, but that is something that we're hoping to do in the future.
Thank you.
Right up here.
That was kind of an answer to my question. But I guess a kind of follow-up to that would be, do you think the acoustic tagging might have an impact at all, or do you think it'd be kind of minimal in reference to everything else going on?
Yeah, so the acoustic tags are at 69 kilohertz, which is well outside of importantly, the range of what the animal itself can hear, right? We don't want to send it to the insane asylum by beeping in its ear every 15 minutes. But it's also importantly out of the range of marine mammal hearing, right? So we're also not putting a tracker on it that a predator or a jerk can come find these fish. So it's safely out of the range of hearing for most of these species.
Hi, thanks for the presentation again. So you said that a small percentage is migrating those large distances. Would you think it's just dietary for those migrations or maybe territorial? And do you think as the population increases that we expect to see a higher percentage migrating farther?
I think that's a tough question, right? Because the aggregation spots where we know them to be, we think are primarily driven by breeding, right? So not by diet or these other things. But what drives migration is a great question. I think like as this species recovers, we're gonna see the aggregations grow. They might get to a size where they're just too big. There's too much competition. They wanna find other spots. There could be food driven, it could be climate driven, it could be a number of different factors. I just don't think we're there yet with the data, but those are some theories that we're sort of working on.
All right, we have time for about 3 more questions, just a heads up.
I wondered, how many eggs are laid at a time and how many survive?
It depends on the size of the female. So there's the whole concept of the big fat female. So the larger the female fish, the more exponential eggs they can produce. But it's believed that the largest recording, they can produce up to 600,000 eggs.
In a single round.
In one round.
Yeah.
In one go, one day. But as you can imagine, not many of those eggs do survive.
We have some questions down the front row right here.
This is more a statement than a question. About 25 years ago, my wife was out of town, so I went fishing like I usually do, and I caught a small black sea bass. That small black sea bass ended up in Cabrillo Beach in the aquarium. When we got it, they called into Cabrillo, and they said they'd really appreciate it and really like it. Well, time flies, and I'm a volunteer here for a while, for about 5 years, and I was told that one of the black sea bass in the tank came from Cabrillo. So it's possible that it's that black sea bass.
I'd love to hear stories about that. It's just incredible.
Sorry it wasn't a question. But
No, it's good.
But yeah, it was really sort of strange to find out that.
Okay, we have one more question up here.
I just wanted to say, first off, thank you for the giant sea bass. Our divers love feeding them so much, so that is amazing. Thank you for that. Quick question for you guys. I noticed that you said that there's a lot of sightings in the summer for the adult giant sea bass. Do you guys see a rise in sightings for juvenile or newborn sea bass at any time of the year?
When it comes to juveniles, we still only have like 60 within our database, so I wouldn't say we can give any kind of correlations in terms of seasonality there. However, from previous studies have shown that a lot of giant sea bass leave in the winter months and come back. But we do have some that have actually been year-round residents, right? And one place that I want to keep bringing up is Hermosa Artificial Reef. The largest sighting there was actually in the winter at 22 giant sea bass, which was in January a few years ago. And so we're not seeing any giants, essentially, or much less giants in other areas. But then for some reason at Hermosa, we still see them basically every month. So there's still a lot of unknowns.
And then I think the other part of that question is that the babies are in a different habitat, right? So Mike Kauffer's here in the audience. He's done a lot of stuff showing that the babies are actually at these sandy flats. They're like hiding in seaweed, and despite them being orange, they camouflage super well in that murky water. So we just don't have the kind of sightings. You can't put a tag in something that small. So that nursery habitat area is something that we're still trying to work on. We have a couple hotspots, mostly thanks to Mike, that we know, but understanding that continual habitat use is going to be totally different from the adults. And I think that's all we have. So thank you again, everyone, for coming. We really super appreciate it.
So if we didn't get to your question, no worries. These folks will be down here to join us and answer any questions that you guys may have, both behind the scenes here, and we'll be down at the front of the house here for some time as well. Just another round of applause for these gentlemen for joining us this evening. So our next first Wednesday, we're going to trick you guys, is taking place on our third Wednesday of the month, so Wednesday, October 16th, regarding bat conservation and preservation. Our talk will be presented by Dr. Merlin Tuttle, a world